So when you want to factor something, the first thing that I want to remind you about is when you learned FOIL, because factoring is just going backwards. This is two factors. You have a factor of x plus 2 and you have a factor of x plus 5. So that's one factor and that's another factor. Now normally when you have to multiply those two things together, you probably learned FOIL. So the first term times the first term gives you x squared. And then you did outer, so that would be x times 5 in this case, or 5x. And then you did inner, and usually outer plus inner you could combine together, because this would be 5x plus 2x. So those are like terms, so I'll just say 7x. And then finally it was last times last. And in this case, that would be 2 times 5. So when I say last, I mean the two last terms in each factor. So 10. What we're doing now when we're trying to factor something is we want to start with this. And we want to get the two factors that go into it. So we're going backwards. So if you look over here at number 1, one way to think about this is that if I want to factor it, I'm assuming it's going to factor into two binomials just like this. So first times first has to equal x squared, and that's kind of a gimme because x times x is the only thing I can think of that would equal x squared. That would be reasonable. What I usually do, as long as there's no number before this x squared, is then I just look at this number and I'm like, okay, last times last. So the numbers that go here have to equal 15. So I say the product is 15. And I just list out everything that gives me a product of 15. But at the same time, outer plus inner, so when I do outer plus inner, that has to equal 8. So the sum has to equal 8. And I usually just list out the stuff that gives me a product of 15. So let's see, 1 times 15, 3 times 5, and it doesn't matter which order I do them in. So that's about it. And then I look for which one of these, when I add those two numbers together, gives me a sum of 8. And of course the answer here would be 3 and 5. They're both positive. So one of these is plus 3 and the other one is plus 5. So just to practice that one more time, and so that's the final answer, is that if I have to factor x squared plus 8x plus 15, I get x plus 3 times x plus 5. So if I have to factor this, x squared minus 3x plus 2 again, I'm going to first look at this first term. As long as there's no number before that x squared, this method works out just fine. X times x will give me the x squared I need. And now I need a product of 2, and the sum has to equal negative 3. So things that give me a product of 2 would be like 1 times 2, negative 1 times negative 2, and that's about it. Doesn't matter what order they're in. So obviously the answer here is a minus 1 and a minus 2, because negative 1 plus negative 2 gives me negative 3 that I need. So I'll say x minus 1, x minus 2. And there's the answer. So that's how you factor if you have no number before that x squared term. In the next video, I'll show you a little more sophisticated way of factoring, and that's if you have a number before that x squared term.